my name is Mark O'Reilly from Fit Vision, and today we're going to look at tips around wellness for shift workers. Where we're going to start with our session today is to look at the dynamic process of wellness. And the diagram that you see here explains it quite effectively. When we think of our wellness, we want to think about the areas of energy. For example, our physical energy, our mental energy, and our emotional energy. We also want to consider the areas of our life that matter most. So what we call our 4 key value areas. And these specifically are our career, our personal development and our health, our close relationships, and also our leisure time, our time for ourselves. And from the time that we wake up to the moment we go to sleep, we are generally performing goal-directed actions in one or more of the 4 areas. And what effectively helps us do that is the energy that we possess. Now, what's important to note is that when it comes to our energy is not just something that we have. Energy is actually something that we create. But we can also spend energy in certain areas. So today what we're going to look at is we're going to look at defining our physical, our mental, and our emotional energy, but also looking at specific actions that we can do to help obviously create more of that energy. When you think of your physical energy, I want you to think about maybe when you wake up, how do you feel? Do you feel quite fatigued, or do you find yourself being able to spring out of the bed? This is a good indication sometimes of where our physical energy may lie. When we think of our mental energy, I want you to think about how easy it is for you to focus on your most important tasks, or how easy it is for you to be distracted. And our emotional energy, well, this is about staying attuned to how we're feeling, maybe how we're experiencing stress within our environment. And we have some tips around that area for you as we move through our session today. But ultimately, we're looking to try and master what we see in our next slide here. We're looking to try and master this movement between energy expenditure and energy renewal. And we're going to do that specifically by looking at our activity levels, the quality of our nutrition, the quality of our recovery, and also our mindset as we look at all of these areas. And we're going to start with our physical activity. As we begin to look at our physical activity, the key point that I want you to take away is what we see here. That within 15 minutes of exercising, we start to experience the benefits. Now, there is a misconception out there that we need 60 minutes of high intense exercise to really make it worthwhile. What I want you to remember is that ultimately what we're striving for is 5 days a week where we're taking part in 30 minutes of moderate intense exercise. And we all know the physical benefits that we can get from our activity, and some of the obvious benefits, like for example, improvements in body composition, so reduction in overall body weight. But what I want to focus on today is actually the benefits we get from a mental perspective in terms of our regular activity. And as we can see from our slide here, the first one we're going to focus on is stress. Now, there's a very interesting hypothesis in terms of our activity, and it's called the cross-stressor adaptation theory. But effectively what this means is that when we bring our body through physical exercise, so we bring it through physical stress, and then it recovers from that physical stress, we're effectively training the body to be able to deal with stress in other areas of our life. And this is a major benefit to regular activity. And as we can see here, aerobic exercise sessions lasting up to 30 minutes help reduce symptoms of stress. And ultimately, we're looking at trying to make it consistent, because we know that if we're performing regular activity for a period of 2 months or more, we start to really experience these benefits that help us deal with chronic stress. Now, let's look at another aspect where regular activity can help. We're looking at anxiety. Many of us can experience anxiety from time to time. I know based on the period of the last 2 years, with a lot of the uncertainty around us, we've all experienced some anxious thoughts. And we see here that regular activity can help reduce those symptoms. And if we take it a step further and we look at depression, we can see obviously some of the rates of depression in Ireland right here. We also know that things like major depressive disorder and dysthymia, which effectively is prolonged depressive symptoms, so mild prolonged depressive symptoms, they actually have a tendency to increase as we get older. If we look at where exercise can help us, however, we see that individuals who were not even meeting the recommendations for exercise, so the 5-30 minutes, they still saw a reduction in overall depressive symptoms. But if we actually meet our guidelines around physical activity, we can effectively halve our chances of suffering from depressive symptoms. So straight away we see that the intensity again has been tested in the study we see here, and we can see that light, moderate or high intense exercise all tend to have a similar effect when it comes to reducing depressive symptoms. So regular activity not only will give us the physical benefits, but it is also critical to our overall mental health. And let's look at some key factors that contribute to things like stress, anxiety and depression. We're going to look at our energy, our fatigue and our mood. Now, we know that when we are experiencing fatigue, so when we are tired, the natural tendency is to skip things like exercise. But what we see here from some of the studies referenced is that although it can seem counterintuitive to exercise when we're fatigued or when we're tired, it can actually help us reduce those levels of fatigue. It can increase our overall mood and increase our energy. So our big takeaway when it comes to activity is to try and strive for the 5-30 minutes of moderate intensity exercise. It's to know that when we do feel fatigued, it's not about skipping the exercise, but it's maybe alternating the exercise, reducing the intensity, and maybe even only striving for that 15 minutes on that day. But it's trying to fit it in to our lifestyle of working shift, because the benefits go far beyond the physical. They really extend to the mental as well. And what we're going to look at next is the role that nutrition plays specifically for shift work. As we now begin to look at our nutrition, we can see the many challenges that working shift can obviously offer. For example, we're looking at maybe skipping meals because we're not feeling hungry. We can also have a tendency to experience energy slumps when we work shift, and this can lead us maybe to focusing on unhealthy snacking, trying to reach out for something that's going to give us that boost in energy. And we want to offer a couple of tips for you today on how you can actually guard against some of those common challenges, because we know that the ultimate consequence obviously is things like weight gain, potential digestion issues and regular declines in our overall mental and physical energy. Now, when we look at some of the tips, I want you to think about trying to break your meals down into smaller portions. Because if we find ourselves not eating at regular times, we're going to find ourselves maybe disrupting things like the quality of our overall sleep. So rather than having our regular breakfast, lunch and dinner, there might be an option to start to bring in smaller meals as we move throughout the day. We know that when we wake up following a shift, we often don't feel quite hungry. So we might strive for something that is maybe smaller in portion size. It might be something that looks like yogurt with some nuts and some fruit rather than having a big breakfast. This can also help us then when it comes to things like maybe having dinner with the family, because that might be the one meal a day that you want to have maybe a big portion where you do feel quite hungry. And obviously the social aspect of having dinner with the family is quite important also. So what I want you to think about right now is I want you to think about the actual shift pattern that you work. I want you to think, if you were to plan 4 to 5 meals, maybe 4 smaller meals and 1 bigger meal, what might those meals actually consist of? Because what we want you to strive for at each of those meals is a source of protein, carbohydrates and fat. And just to give you some examples, when we think about protein, we're thinking about good quality, maybe white meats, fish, eggs, etc. Red meat is okay, but we're obviously trying to have that on occasion rather than having that quite regularly. When we think of carbohydrates that we should be eating, again, there's a misconception that carbohydrates are bad for us. They're not. Effectively, carbohydrates are providing our body and mind with energy. So we need them. But it's about the choice of carbohydrates. We can often, again, reach for that quick sugar hit to give us a boost in energy. Now, that creates a vicious cycle because I find my energy levels going quite high, but then they can drop low quite rapidly. An example would be if I have a breakfast maybe that consists of orange juice, maybe a high sugary cereal, fruit flavoured yogurt. On the surface that can look like a relatively healthy breakfast, but because there's no protein and there's no fat, I find my blood sugar levels spiking and then my energy levels can drop quite low. This leaves me feeling physically and mentally drained and obviously searching for that next hit. So good quality sources of carbohydrate would be porridge, brown pasta, brown rice, even good quality breads, vegetables, fruits. And although these cannot look very appetizing when we are on shift, these are the actual foods that will give the body and give our cells the nutrients that are needed. They're going to give us that sustainable energy that's required. Whereas if we continue to stay in the cycle of reaching for the high sugary snack, we're constantly going to feel ourselves fatigued and reaching for maybe things like sugar or caffeine to give us a pick-me-up. Another critical step in terms of our nutrition is to stay hydrated. By staying hydrated, we can actually stave off some of those hunger pangs. Often we can feel like we're hungry when actually what it is that we're actually dehydrated. And just to go back for a second, when you're thinking about fats and good fats in your diet, what you're thinking about here is things like nuts, cooking in good quality oils, like for example olive oil, but even using things like butter if you're making your sandwich. There is a lot of research now that shows the benefits of fats like butter in our diet. So trying to build our maybe 4 mini meals around good quality protein, carbohydrates and fats, and then obviously looking at maybe that larger meal being the meal that we have with the family in the evening time, and again trying to have your regular dinner. So it could be something like your spaghetti bolognese. So you've got your protein in your meat, you've got your obviously carbohydrates in your brown pasta and any good quality vegetables that you've got on that plate as well. And then the good fats that may be in a meal like that might be the oil that the actual meat was cooked in. So again, simple steps that can seem difficult to take, but once we start to make those small adjustments to our diet, we really start to see the difference in our energy levels as we move through our shift. Now, one thing we want to touch on, which is important when it comes to our nutrition, is the amount of coffee that we can drink. And I know that this is an important aspect of working shift. I've worked with many groups who work shift throughout the years, and they tell me that obviously if, for example, they're driving home after a long evening shift, they may have a coffee before they get into the car for obvious reasons. So what I want you to consider is not necessarily about immediately taking the coffee away, but I want you to ask yourself the question, if you're having 4 or 5 coffees just to get yourself through an evening shift, what are other things that you could do to help increase your energy? We've mentioned some of them there in terms of our nutrition. We've looked at some already in terms of our activity levels. And all I want you to consider is, what ones could you start to explore in order to help you build more sustainable energy? Because if we find ourselves surviving on sugar and coffee, well, long term, that is going to effectively provide health implications. We are now going to move into looking at our sleep and recovery. And I know the difficulty around sleep, obviously, in terms of shift work. But what I want to try and do today is to show you effective ways in which you can get recovery. So yes, we know that obviously good quality sleep is key to recovery. But unfortunately, we're not like the batteries on our phone. We don't plug ourselves in when we go to sleep and wake up fully charged. So we need to look at other avenues in order to enhance our recovery. And a couple of things that I want to reference, and we can see them here with our effective recovery tips. The first one is that we can often find ourselves struggling to fall asleep after an evening shift. What I want you to remember is that any time where you're relaxing your body and mind and you're away from any technology, any stimulation, you're offering recovery to your body and mind. So even if you can't sleep, even lying there in bed is helping your body ultimately recover. It's helping your mind recover. But often we can feel quite stressed if we don't drift off straight away. I want you to try and shift your mindset in regard to how you see that period. So if you are finding it difficult to get to sleep, I don't want you to panic, I don't want you to stress. I want you to just use that time to allow your body and mind to recover. You can focus on something as simple as your breathing. And what you'll find is that if you focus in on your breathing, you just become aware of your inhalation, your exhalation. You'll start to slow down that breathing rate. That will calm your body and ultimately calm your mind. And you'll find yourself drifting off to sleep. But there are many other ways in which we can enhance our recovery. And we can see some of them here. Like, rather than moving towards TV, which again is going to stimulate our mind, or picking up our phone and scrolling on our phone, even opting for things like reading a book or listening to an audiobook can enhance our recovery and also help us fall asleep quicker and increase that overall sleep quality. Because sleep hygiene is obviously vitally important. And where many of us can trip up is that maybe we eat too close to bedtime, or we have stimulants like caffeine too close to bed, or when we get in after a long shift, we jump in front of the TV or we're scrolling on our phone. All of these things are going to prevent us from getting a good night's sleep. We can see some simple tips as well, like obviously introducing things like blackout blinds. What that will do is effectively increase our production of what's known as melatonin, which is effectively our sleep hormone, and that will help increase again our ability to get off to sleep, but also the quality of that overall sleep. Other things we can do as we move through our day is to be conscious of, are we giving ourselves a little bit of a break as we move through our day? Many of us can have a tendency to go from obviously our first task in the day to our last task and not really give ourselves adequate break. We can find ourselves maybe while we're eating our lunch either on our phone or looking at our laptop. I want you to start to try and get into the habit of giving yourself 5 minutes where maybe you're getting outside for a walk, or you're just giving yourself a bit of time to think without any distraction. And if we think about as we come towards the end of our day, so we finished our shift, it's also a good exercise to start maybe writing down, as we can see here, some of the worries, some of the stresses, some of our thoughts. Sometimes getting them out of our head and down onto paper can help. This is often something we avoid because maybe we don't see the instant benefit. But trust me, bringing in an exercise like this, like journaling, can help us shift some of what's cluttering our mind, getting it down on paper, and again, ultimately increasing our overall mental and physical recovery. Because remember what we said at the start of today's session. We're looking at ways in which we can create energy, because energy is not just something we have, but we also spend energy in all of those 4 key value areas as we move throughout our day. Now, what we're going to look at next are ways in which we can manage the inevitable stress that can come at us as we move through our day. Before we begin to look at stress, I want to introduce you to this process. So as we can see here, effectively this works all through the day, where we have thoughts about different things in our environment or actions we want to take. Those thoughts will drive feelings, and then ultimately we will be pushed towards the right action, the wrong action, or in some cases, no action at all. Let's use an example. So let's look at exercise. If my thought around the exercise I'm going to do that day is, it looks like it might rain outside, I actually feel quite tired today, etc. Well, that stream of thoughts is going to probably drive negative feelings. I'm going to not really feel too motivated to get outside and do the walk that I was going to take. And then ultimately the action, well, we may be actually driven towards inaction. So one important point here for us to make is that when you think of your thoughts towards whether it's your nutrition, whether it's changing some of your sleep habits, or whether it's trying to increase your activity, it's important to make sure that we know that we're in control and we have a choice of the thoughts that we're effectively driving in order to encourage positive feelings and appropriate actions. So what I want you to try and do is the next time you've got some exercise planned or you want to make a change with your nutrition, I want you to try and be aware of what thoughts start to come up in your own mind. Are they the thoughts that we mentioned earlier on? It looks a little bit cold, I feel a little bit tired, etc. Can you flip some of those thoughts? Can you start to, for example, say, I am feeling a little bit tired today, but I know from the webinar that we did that actually I only need to perform my exercise for 15 to 30 minutes. It only needs to be moderate intensity exercise, and actually I'm going to experience all of those mental and physical benefits. Because straight away when we start to change that thought process ourselves, we produce positive feelings and we can start to take action. And the great thing about this process is it can be used with any change you're trying to make, whether it's nutrition or changes around your sleep or even how you perceive stress in your life. And that's what we're going to actually look at next. So what's quite interesting here is that this was a study that was done in the States. 30,000 individuals in total were asked the 2 questions that you see here. Now, the study itself was a little bit morbid, so the researchers followed the individuals for 8 years, asking them those 2 questions every year, and at the end of the 8 years, they sourced the death records of the individuals. Now, what was quite interesting, and no prizes for guessing, was that the individuals that said that they suffered from high levels of stress and saw stress as something that was harmful, well, yes, as we can see here, they were in the highest death rate. But what was quite interesting in terms of this study was that it wasn't the individuals that said that they suffered from low levels of stress that were in the lowest death rate. It was actually the individuals that said that they suffered from or experienced high levels of stress, but actually saw it as something that was enhancing. So straight away, think of that process we introduced you to. Thoughts, feelings, and actions. If I view the stress in my life as a challenge rather than a threat, well then all of a sudden I'm producing positive feelings. I'm producing actions that help me deal with that stress. And let's try and bring in an example here by looking at the different forms of stress or adversity that we can face. So as we can see here, right down at the bottom of our screen is acute stress. And it's acute because it's highly predictable and not very intense. An example of this could be if we're driving into work and we find ourselves sitting in traffic. If we leave at the same time every day, We might know that we're going to hit that traffic, but how do we perceive that traffic? Do I find myself getting quite agitated? Do I find myself beeping the horn? All of a sudden, that's going to increase my overall stress, or it might change my mindset, my thoughts towards that stress. Or do I look at that time as an opportunity to maybe stick on a podcast or listen to some of my favourite music? Again, thinking of what thoughts that will produce, what feelings will be driven, and what actions will be the consequence of both those thoughts and feelings. Now, if we continue to move up, we see our episodic stress. Our episodic stress might be something like having to do a one-on-one. So all of a sudden you've got to sit down with a colleague, and either you're a manager or you're meeting your manager. This can create increased anxiety or stress because the intensity is increased. Now, the benefit here is it is predictable. We know that the meeting is coming up. But again, think about what your thoughts are towards it. Are you seeing it as critical? Are you fearful of the situation? Or are you seeing it as an opportunity to maybe express some of the things that you're on your mind at the moment? Maybe some of the things that you're struggling with in terms of your overall performance. And then as we move up, we see that we've got chronic stress. Now that's obviously less predictable and increased in terms of our intensity. And this, for example, might be maybe a family member is unwell and we don't know when they're going to get better. So we're carrying around this stress, which causes obviously anxiety. And ultimately I'm going to show you ways to deal with that. But I want you to remember that by checking in with our thought process, checking in with what we call our self-talk, we can start to actually reframe our situation. And that has certainly helped with what we see right up the top here, adversity. And the best form of adversity is looking at the pandemic that we faced. What was your mindset? What was your thought process towards it? Did you see some of the benefit, although that can be difficult, of maybe having a little bit more time with our loved ones because maybe we weren't racing out the door, heading off here, there and everywhere? Again, it's trying to think about how do I view my current situation, because bringing it back to the stress study that we referenced, that can be critical in the overall effect that the stress may have on us. But let's look at a way in which we can handle that stress better. So this is our stress coping model. And where we start here, the first point is to remember that we will generally experience stress physically first. So I want you to start to try and become aware when you feel your heart rate increasing, your muscles getting quite tense, or even things like your palms getting sweaty. Things like that are signs that we're starting to experience stress. And the way we can deal with that very simply is to just focus in on our breathing. So just give ourselves a moment to take a breath. We've often heard in the past, if we are quite anxious or stressed, people might say, head out for a walk, take a breath, take a moment. Well, the reason why they say that is because it's true. If we can bring ourselves into a moment where we're just focusing on our breath, we're starting to move from what's known as our sympathetic nervous system, our threat state, into more of a relaxed, what's known as our parasympathetic nervous system. And this is our rest and digest. Once we've done that, once we've noticed the stress symptoms in the body, once we've taken a breath, what we'll normally tend to find is we have control of the body, which can help us think about the situation in a more rational fashion. So rather than trying to solve a problem in our mind when we don't have control of our body, that can lead us obviously to all of a sudden being quite frantic in our thought process. If we have control of the body, we can start to rationalize. We can start to make better decisions. So effectively, it looks like this. If I'm experiencing any of those forms of stress that we spoke about, your acute stress, your episodic stress, your chronic stress, or even your adversity, I want you to try and bring yourself away for a moment. Take a breath. Reduce those stress symptoms and see what impact that has on how you view the situation. I also want you to use the tool of trying to reframe that situation. Remember, you do have a choice when it comes to your thought process. Maybe not the initial thought, but you do have a choice on where you decide to bring your thoughts after that, whether it's with exercise, stress, nutrition, or recovery. And in our last part of this video, we're going to look at a simple 5-step process on how you can start to take action. Where I'd like to finish today's session is looking at closing the gap. So ultimately, in every area that we've spoken about today, exercise, nutrition, sleep, stress, we might find ourselves in a certain position now, and we may have an ideal scenario. So let's take exercise as our example. I may find myself now doing very little exercise each week, but I know that my ideal scenario, where I want to be eventually, is 30 minutes of moderate intensity exercise. It's unrealistic for us to jump from where we are now straight to those 30 minutes. But there's a simple process I'm going to show you to help you close that gap. The first step is the awareness, and that's what we focused on in today's webinar, highlighting the things that can help us when it comes to that dynamic of wellness. The second step is ownership. It's very easy for us to say that maybe I'm just too tired to exercise, or if I didn't work shift, I would exercise every day. What I want you to do is to start exploring the possibility. What can you do? You may not be able to do 30 minutes right away, but maybe you can get 2 to 3 sessions per week. So that's you taking ownership and exploring the possibility and not just focusing on what you can't do right now. The next step then is the old story, and that ties in some of what we've just mentioned. Are you constantly telling yourself things that are going to stop you or act as barriers, like I'm too tired to exercise? We know that it doesn't have to be that intense. It's low to moderate to get those benefits. It can be 15 to 30 minutes. So let's try again to reframe our thoughts. So let's try and create a new story. And that would be step 4 in the process. And the final step in terms of closing the gap from where we are now to where we want to be is taking action. And I want you to remember, it's about taking small actions. We've talked about a lot of tips in today's session. I don't want you to try and implement them all right away. That's going to be very difficult and not very sustainable. I want you to pick one. And if you're picking something like exercise, I want you to try and break it down into small processes. It might be things like lying your gear out the night before a training session. It might be actually picking the days and the times that you're going to exercise. And then it might be just starting with that first session. That's how we take action, and that's how we move from where we are now to where we want to be in any of those areas. That's how we create energy to help us achieve the goals that we set in those 4 key value areas while we continue to work shift. I hope the tips today have been helpful to you, and as always, please feel free to reach out to me directly. My email address is mark@fitvision.ie. Thank you.